Watching him agenda, we've just been seeing the US Secretary of State John Kerry talking to some school kids there on Sydney Harbour. He's talking to them, I think they've left the boat, the Young Endeavour, but he's talking more about the oceans. You heard him talking about some of the importance of efforts globally, particularly in the United States, to try and clean up the oceans. He's talking about that more right now. You can listen to more of that on Multiview. Just press the red button. Now let's bring in our panel. With me here in Canberra, Grahame Morris, and in Sydney, welcome back to Bruce Hawker. Good to see you both back in the chair again. I want to talk about the situation in Iraq firstly, which is likely to dominate tomorrow's OSMIN talks between the US Secretary of State, Defence Secretary and their Australian counterparts. So far, Grahame, it's a humanitarian mission. There's still this big question about humanitarian mission with some targeted US airstrikes. But the question is, and you heard the question to Chuck Hagel earlier, what's the aim here? We're going to try and push back ISIS beyond the positions they currently occupy. He's leaving that open. And Australia's position is certainly that we heard David Johnson say that we don't telegraph our punches. Where is this going, do you think?
Look, David, I've got a really strong view that the humanitarian side of this is right. And Australia's good at it, and it sort of makes you proud, and it was a part of the world where we were trying to help anyway. Before we get to the military side, I think the foreign ministers and the defence ministers, both Australia and the US while they're here, had want to start building the case. I don't think the case has yet been made as to why Australia would be involved in a military sense. And while we're at it, what are the Europeans doing? What are the other Muslim countries doing? We are fantastic at helping people in trouble. But by geez, there are other people who ought to be pulling their weight too. And I just think I'm not quite sure that the case has yet been made for military intervention or involvement by Australia, and I think it's quite a reasonable role for the foreign ministers and the foreign secretary and the defence ministers and defence secretary to start to build that case while they're here in the next few days.
Isn't the part of that case though, and I agree, both governments, US and Australia, need to do this if this is where they're heading. But part of the case is being built, isn't it, by what's these sort of shocking images that we're seeing, the sheer number of Australians who are involved and the potential for them to come back and wage atrocities here as well, which is being taken very seriously, as you know, by intelligence agencies. Isn't this a reason why we arguably should be involved in any effort to push back this group?
Look, I think that's right, but it's a bigger argument, I think, as to why our forces and our agencies and whatnot in Australia need all the power they can get. And if these pictures on the front page this morning are any real example of the lunatic Australians who are involved in this, then I'm quite happy if ASIO can tap everything that I've ever listened to or read, providing they stop these idiots from doing anything like that. To involve children like that, what sort of mentality, what sort of drongo, what sort of mongrel would ever do that with a child?
Exactly, and I was making the point earlier, this is evidence, another reminder of how far removed they are from our values, this Western social norms.
Yeah, and also I reckon it's time that the Muslim leaders stood up and said something on this.
Well, Bruce, Labor opposed the war in Iraq back in 2003. It supported Afghanistan. How do you view what's happening in Iraq at the moment and the potential for any military engagement?
Well, of course, once Saddam Hussein was removed, then it created this vacuum that's subsequently been filled by these appalling jihadists. But given that has happened, and it would appear that the Iraq government is not really capable of withstanding the force of this ISIS crowd, then I think the United States has to get involved and get involved heavily as they're to the extent that they need to. And I think Australia needs to keep its options open as well for all the reasons that you've just been talking about. I mean, these people are absolutely appalling, barbarous characters who really belong in the 12th century or earlier rather than the 21st. And I think it's sensible for the government to keep its options wide open on it, and I would expect that Labor will provide bipartisan support for the government unless, you know, they go down some route that we haven't anticipated at all.
Just on that, I mean, Labor hasn't yet backed in the measures that were announced last week. I think the briefings, or first round of briefings, happened on Friday afternoon for Labor. Do you expect, Bruce, Labor will ultimately back in what was announced?
Yes, I do. That's my feeling based on the experience of these matters over many, many years. Ultimately, when, you know, push comes to shove and there's an expectation that Australia will come to the party in some shape or form, hopefully just in the form of humanitarian aid at this stage anyway, then I think Labor will be will come in and support the measures as well.
So the anti-terror measures, though, the things like metadata retention, the things like declaring terrorist no-go zones, that you'd have to prove what you were doing there and you weren't involved in terrorist activity. I mean, these are some of the sensitive elements that were announced last week. Greens don't like them, but you reckon Labor will get on board?
I think Labor will ultimately support them. They may have some qualms about certain aspects of them at the extreme end, but I would be surprised if Labor didn't say, look, if this has to be done in order to be certain of securing Australia's internal security, then we'll get on board.
Well, there's obviously a lot of discussion to take place tomorrow at those AUSBIN talks. The Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, after his one-day visit to the Netherlands, will be in London talking to intelligence officials there about the situation in Iraq as well. So this could be a critical week in many ways as to what's happening in Iraq and Australia's involvement there. I want to turn to the budget, though, now. Difficulties for the Treasurer keep coming back home. One of his predecessors, Peter Costello, the Liberal Party, Grahame, I'm sure you'd say Liberal Party's favourite treasurer, has weighed into this debate. I want to show you a little of the free advice he had for Joe Hockey on one of the most contentious budget measures, the GP co-payment.
If the Senate's really going to vote against something, right, there's no point in saying we're right and you're wrong. You know, sooner or later you've got to cut your losses. And there are a couple of measures there, I think, which won't go through. And, you know, I think...
So which ones would you cut?
Well, the $7 co-payment, I know it's not going to go through. It's just not going to happen.
So drop it.
So let's move on.
And here's what Joe Hockey thought of that advice.
Well, it's not good advice because, frankly, our budget is part of an overarching economic action strategy that has a number of different component parts. Putting a price signal in relation to visits to the doctor and ensuring that the Medicare system is sustainable is a key part of that program. We are facing a Medicare system that is growing at in excess of 7% per annum.
Now, Grahame Morris, what did you make of Peter Costello's comments there?
Well, he's sort of right, but he's a bit early. You know, I still reckon Treasurer Hockey ought to put it to the House of Reps and it will pass there. And then it goes to the Senate and then he does some more negotiation. You know, that's what Peter Costello did with the GST. It's what Peter Reith did with the industrial relations.
And Joe Hockey pointed to the GST experience in that interview as well this morning, that it did take a lot of time and sacrifices.
Oh, it took a couple of weeks and fresh food came out. But in the end, the sort of Peter Costello and John Howard, they got 80% of what they wanted. Well, that's not bad. But it's still too early. There are still negotiations with the independent senators, but it may well be that there's a huge outbreak of wisdom in the Labor Party. And I remember some very wise person writing recently saying that the Labor Party ought to allow the government to pass all these measures. Otherwise, all of the policy decisions will be made by the Palmer crowd. Labor will become irrelevant, and that will put them into opposition for even more years. Oh, sorry, Bruce, that was
Genius, a genius. A good time for me to come in. Look, I think Peter Costello certainly is showing a lot of pragmatism in his approach. It's probably the mirror image to my point about it, and that was that, you know, sometimes governments just have to be judged on what they are proposing and what they want to do. And this was a classic example of a government that was engaging in extreme overreach. I didn't mean to say that I justify or condone anything that they had in those budget measures, quite the contrary. I just think that they have to be held accountable for what they do from time to time. And I think Costello is saying, now's the time to actually engage in a bit of a sensible retreat from these measures, because you're not going to be judged well by the Australian public on matters like the co-payment for Medicare. I mean, there's a very good reason why Medicare has been part and parcel of our system since 1983, and that's because it's extremely popular with the Australian public, and it hasn't been tampered with by any government, really. So that's where I think Labor is on the strong moral ground on this issue, and the government just is floundering when it comes to this and a lot of other measures. It's not just the co-payment, it's all the other measures that go on top of it.
Well, there's the higher education reforms, then there's the non-budget measures like paid parental leave and the rest. Grahame, your advice then to the government, if they really do want to get the bulk of this through anyway, what do they need to do that they're not currently doing?
Well, in some cases, the Palmer people are saying, let's see the legislation first. So we're not even at the negotiating stage in some of these sort of things. But, you know, I would listen to what the independents and the Palmer people are saying and just see if there can be some accommodation for what they want to do, either pruning back the government's ideal sort of position or maybe softening it with something else. But I think everyone's got to accept that the budget as presented in this sort of parliament is not going to be accepted. So what will be accepted? But I also, you know, it is almost time. Why are we doing this? Because we're trying to fill Labor's $47 billion black hole. And at some stage, things will become comparative. And people will say, well, OK, the government's struggling to fill Labor's black hole. How is Labor going to fill it if they don't want all these things? And, you know, then there's a bit of pressure on the other side.
That time will come, no question about that. Not this afternoon, though, because we're out of time. Grahame Morris, Bruce Hawker, thank you very much for joining us. We'll catch up with you both next week. Now, we'll take a break. Back with more on PM Agenda. We are going